Fiasco in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. Letter number 675, 23 April 1961. On Wednesday evening last week, you could have seen a band of pickets marching and stamping in front of the Russian house on Park Avenue. They carried placards reading "Cuba Sí, Communism No" and "Hands Off Cuba." A mile away, over by the East River, another band of pickets marched and stamped across from the United Nations Plaza. They too carried placards reading "Yanks Stay Home, Hands Off Cuba." At least one picket in each group had to be led away by the cops for passionate behavior constituting a threat to the public safety. It would be useful to know the names of these foaming partisans, because they mark the two extremes of the wild and wobbly gamut of views on Cuba, which have been exposed here by the UN General Assembly's Political Committee, in Washington by the Congress, the State Department, and the President, by the press of the Western Hemisphere, and by pickets and newspapers in a score or more countries of Europe and the Middle East. Most people interested or aroused by the Cuban invasion, from United Nations delegates to Ukrainian peasants, from sugar importers to British Labour leaders, seem to be convinced that they have got to the heart of the matter. At best, they allow the plausibility of one other argument and then reject it. But it strikes me that nobody has laid out the range of arguments. It becomes plainer with every new debate in the UN that can and will be applied to practically every uprising anywhere in the world. Now, if this sounds like a rhetorical phrase tossed in to make the sentence end with a bang, let me quote the words spoken before the United Nations Assembly by the delegate from Saudi Arabia on Thursday. Mr. Ahmad Sukairi challenged UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson to deny that refugees from Castro's Cuba had been trained and armed in the United States. Mr. Sukairi said he respected the right of any refugees to struggle for the freedom of their homeland, but he wondered whether the United States would be prepared to let refugees from Oman train in the United States against Great Britain, the power that occupied their homeland. The day before, Britain had been under much the same sort of fire from the Arabs, who introduced a protest in the political committee against British intervention in Oman. They said that British soldiers and bases were in Oman not to protect the freedom of the people, but to protect Britain's domination of the oil deposits. It has been an uncomfortable week both for the Mother of Parliaments and for the land of the free, or in the Russian translation, the colonial imperialists and the American monopolists. Now back to our bewildering collection of views on Cuba. I cannot pretend to offer an orderly progression of arguments, but only a random collection of raw materials for an anthology of opinion that somebody ought to make. None of these views was delivered mockingly by the sources I shall quote. Some of them, we are bound to deduce, are held cynically or expediently, but most of them are the sincere conclusions of men who have looked at what they take to be the facts. Perhaps we should say at the beginning that the facts, even the most elementary events of the rebel invasion, are extremely hard to come by. Most American information about the rebellion comes from a combination of sources, none of which, until Friday, when the American correspondents in Cuba were released, was in sight of the hostilities. The main dispatches about the fighting, where it took place, the numbers engaged, the actual identity of the rebels, came out of Miami, Florida, which, during the winter, has tried to house and feed refugees whose numbers are variously estimated at 30,000 or 75,000. It is hinted, but never positively stated, that many of these people are ex-Castro soldiers, civilian patriots, malcontents who have volunteered at known recruiting stations to go back to Cuba and fight for their land. Miami, too, receives the broadcasts of powerful transmitters near Havana. But the most powerful broadcasts of all, which bombard southern Florida, the Bahamas, and the Caribbean, are English-language news broadcasts from Moscow. They are incessant, and they are alert, and, in their fashion, informative. And it may explain why the blood pressure of Floridians is always a little higher than that of most of us when the threat of communism to Latin America is mentioned. The other sources of our information are the statements of the Cuban Revolutionary Council and its president, Dr. José Cardona, in New York, the statements of Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and of the President. Already you will see that I am lumping together sources of fact and one-sided interpreters of those facts. We had better confess now that none of us here, and none of you in Britain, neither your leader-writers nor ours, nor the pickets and demonstrators anywhere in the world, know for certain whether 50,000 men or 500 landed in Cuba. The Havana radio went off the air immediately after the invasion was announced, and came back on Friday morning, to announce that the uprising was a failure, and that Dr. Fidel Castro was in fine shape, and personally supervising mopping-up operations in or near Matanzas. The reassurance about Dr. Castro's health was necessary because even the most serious Republican newspaper reported in its early bird edition on Friday morning that Dr. Castro was out of circulation because of a mental or physical collapse, probably mental. This news came from something described as a private organization for inter-American affairs in Miami. The newspaper quietly deleted this story from its breakfast edition. All we knew a week ago, and all we can be really sure of today, is what Havana admitted, that 3 Cuban air bases were bombed, with the loss of 7 people and 24 wounded, that there were 2 or 3 landings on Cuban soil last Monday at possibly 3 places, probably one in Oriente Province, which was Castro's landing place, another in Las Villas Province. We can say pretty certainly what Mr. Stevenson admitted on Thursday night as a melancholy fact, that the rebellion had fizzled. That same night, reams of lamentations came out of Washington, regretting, quite correctly I believe, that the whole invasion had been ballooned beyond its reality by the Miami correspondents, by the anti-Castro groups here, by the first bulletins issued by Dr. Cardona's Revolutionary Council. On the frail basis of these rags and snatches of fact, what were the distinguished delegates in the United Nations saying about it all? Mr. Stevenson at first repeated the President's assurance that no American forces would, under any circumstances, intervene in Cuba. By Thursday, the President himself had changed this to read, "Any unilateral American intervention, in the absence of an external attack upon ourselves or an ally, would have been contrary to our traditions and to our international obligations. But let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible." Mr. Stevenson said the next day that the failure of the rebellion proved that it was not an American military operation. For how long do you think Cuba, a small, almost defenseless island, could resist the military power of the United States? Dr. Roa, the Cuban Foreign Secretary, showed the Assembly photographs of Browning and Thompson machine guns, and said they had been captured in Cuba. Mr. Stevenson showed the Assembly photographs of the bombers that escaped to Florida, and said the markings on the planes showed them to be Castro's own. Then came the deluge of dialectic, unsupported accusations, evidence quoted but never ascribed to a common or an agreed source. The Russians, of course, and the Poles and Czechs and Bulgars and Romanians have had a field day. They have revelled in quotations from the New York Times of weeks ago, dispatches from Washington and Florida and Guatemala, rather sadly warning the reader that anti-Castro Cubans were being trained by the American military in camps in Guatemala, in Florida, and in Louisiana. The Russians, echoed later by the Arabs, say that these people were mercenaries. Dr. Roa says not a single Cuban was among them. Nobody gives proof of either opinion. And thickening the atmosphere outside the assembly were the black headlines of the evening newspapers saying that 50,000 Cubans had been thrown into emergency concentration camps, that priests had been jailed, that 2 Americans and 7 Cubans had been executed. Dr. Roa jumped in just before lunch one day to announce that a young American, a Bostonian, had been captured in Cuba and his American airplane brought down. He gave the man's address and his Social Security number. That was the first and the last we heard of him. No confirmation of this came out of Havana or from any other documentary source the Communists or the Cubans cared to offer. Meanwhile, back in their rocking chairs, the Washington correspondents were speculating why President Kennedy had suddenly toughened his threat to see that Cuba would not be abandoned to communism. Some of these correspondents have access to the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, and it is a safer guess than most that the best of them were repeating fears felt in the State Department and arguments being bandied about the White House. The most relevant of them, and one that any fair-minded Briton or American has to consider, is simply this. There is no doubt at all that the Russians and the Chinese have been sending into Cuba, all through the winter, technical commissions and military advisers. There is ample proof that thousands of bright high school students are being shipped from Cuba to be educated in the Soviet Union. There has been no denial from the Russians that brigades of Cuban flyers are now in Czechoslovakia learning to fly MiGs, and that they will soon be back and hope to form the expert nucleus of a considerable Cuban Air Force. There is also no denial that the tanks Castro's armies used came from the Soviet Union and the machine guns from Czechoslovakia. Who, then, is the interventionist? That is the question we have to answer. The Indians, the Arabs, some Africans, and the Mexicans do not hesitate to echo the Soviets and say, the United States. We all know that the United States was arming the rebel side and the communists the other side. Unfortunately for the legal position of the United States, the other side was a government in being. The interventionist is the man who wants to upset any government in power, no matter how threatening in the long run that government may become to his own security. The non-interventionist is the man who builds up the threat, provided he is arming a government in power. This was the dilemma that faced President Kennedy. He realized that the Monroe Doctrine, which 140 years ago warned all foreign powers to stay out of this hemisphere, was written when foreign powers moved physically by sea. Now they move by subversion, by ideology, by educating the young, by exporting arms and importing aviators. The President took the risk of embarrassing the legal and moral position of the United States by backing a small rebellion in order to warn the Soviet Union that any big excursion out of Cuba into Latin America, when the Cubans become powerfully armed and trained, will be met by American arms. This I believe to be the gist of American policy. Unhappily, the United States was the nearest place the refugees could flee to, and so this Kennedy Doctrine was applied to a rebellion encouraged in the United States, and to an adventure so puny that when it fell, it brought down with it the prestige of the United States as a keeper of international law, and her reputation as a powerful defender of the weak. Gary Cooper, 1901 to 1961. Guardian, 18 May 1961. When the word got out that Gary Cooper, who died on Saturday, aged 60, was mortally ill, a spontaneous process arose in high places not unlike the first moves to sanctify a remote peasant. The Queen of England dispatched a sympathetic cable. The President of the United States called him on the telephone. A cardinal ordered public prayers. Messages came to his house in Beverly Hills from the unlikeliest fans, from foreign ministers and retired soldiers who never knew him, as also from Ernest Hemingway, his old Pygmalion, who had kept him in mind through at least 2 novels, as the archetype of the Hemingway hero, the self-sufficient male animal, the best kind of hunter, the silent infantryman, padding dutifully forward to perform the soldier's most poignant ritual in the ultimate loneliness of contact. It did not happen to Ronald Colman, or Clark Gable, or, heaven knows, John Barrymore. Why, we may well ask, should it have happened to Frank James Cooper, the rather untypical American type of the son of a Bedfordshire lawyer, a boy brought up in the Rockies, among horses and cattle to be sure, but only as they composed the unavoidable backdrop of life in those parts, a schoolboy in Dunstable, a college boy in Iowa, a middling student, then a failing cartoonist, failed salesman, an extra in Hollywood, who in time had his break and mooned in a lanky, handsome way through a score or more of horse operas. Well, his friends most certainly mourn the gentle, shambling Coop. But what the world mourns is the death of Mr. Longfellow Deeds, who resisted and defeated the corruption of the big city, the snuffing out of the sheriff in high noon, heading back to duty along the railroad tracks, with that precise mince of the cowboy's tread, and that rancher's squint that sniffs mischief in a creosote bush, sees through suns, and is never fooled. What the world mourns is its lost innocence, a favourite fantasy of it fleshed out in the most durable and heroic of American myths, that of the taut but merciful plainsman, who dispenses justice with a worried conscience, a single syllable, a blurred reflex action to the hip, and who must face death in the afternoon as regularly as the matador, but on Main Street and for no pay. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town marks the first gelling of this fame, and The Plainsman the best delineation of the character that fixed his legend. These 2 films retrieved Cooper from a run of agreeable and handsome parts, some of them, in the Lubitsch films for instance, too chic and metropolitan for his own good. At the time of Mr. Deeds, an English critic wrote that the conception of the wise underdog, the shrewd hick, is probably too Western, too American in its fusion of irony and sentimentality to travel far. He was as wrong as could be, for the film was a sensation in Poland, the Middle East, and other barbaric regions whose sense of what is elementary in human goodness is something we are just discovering, perhaps a little late. It is easy to forget now, as always with artists who have matured a recognizable style, that for at least the first dozen years of his film career, Gary Cooper was the lowbrow's comfort and the highbrow's butt. However, he lasted long enough, as all great talents do, to weather the 4 stages of the highbrow treatment. First, he was derided, then ignored, then accepted, then discovered. We had seen this happen many times before, and looking back, one is always shocked to recognize the people it has happened to. Today, the intellectual would deny, for instance, that Katharine Hepburn was ever anything but a lovely, if haggard, exotic, with a personal style that might enchant some people and grate on others, but at all times what we call a serious talent. This opinion was, in fact, a highly sophisticated second thought, one that took about a decade to ripen and squelch the memory of Dorothy Parker's little tribute to Miss Hepburn's first starring appearance on Broadway. Miss Hepburn ran the gamut of human emotions from A to B. At least until the mid-30s, there was no debate about Gary Cooper because he presented no issue. He belonged to the reveries of the middle-class woman. He reminded grieving mothers of the upright son shot down on the Somme, devoted sisters of the brother sheep-ranching in Australia, the New York divorcee of the handsome ranch hand with whom she is so often tempted to contract a ruinous second marriage in the process of dissolving her first. To the moviegoer, Cooper was the matinee idol toughened and tanned in the era of the outdoors into something at once glamorous and primitive. He was notoriously known as the actor who couldn't act. Only the directors who handled him had daily proof of the theory that the irresistible stars are simply behaviorists who, by some nervous immunity to the basilisk glare and hiss of the camera, appear to be nobody but themselves. Very soon the box offices from Tokyo to Carlisle confirmed this theory in hard cash. Then the intellectuals sat up and took notice. Then the Cooper legend took over. For the past quarter-century, Cooper's worldwide image had grown so rounded, so heroically elongated rather, that only some very crass public behavior could have smudged it. There was none. After a short separation, he was happily reunited with his only wife. He spoke out during the McCarthy obscenity with resounding pointlessness and flourished the banner of Americanism in a heated way. Most recently, there has been a low-pressure debate in progress in fan magazines and newspaper columns about whether his yup, nope approach was his own or a press agent's inspiration, like the malapropisms of Sam Goldwyn, another happy device for blinding mockers to the knowledge that they were losing their shirts. This was decided a week or two ago by the New York Post, which concluded, after a series of exclusive interviews with his friends, that Cooper's inarticulateness was natural when he was in the presence of gabby strangers, that gabbiness was his natural bent with close friends. He could probably have transcended or dimmed bigger scandals or more public foolishness than he was capable of, because he was of the company of Chaplin, Groucho Marx, W.C. Fields, Bogart, Louis Jouvet, 2 or 3 others, give or take personal favorites. He filled an empty niche in the world pantheon of essential gods. If no cowboy was ever like him, so much the worse for the cattle kingdom. He was Eisenhower's glowing and glowingly false picture of Wyatt Earp. He was one of Walt Whitman's troop of democratic knights, bright-eyed as hawks, with their swarthy complexions and their broad-brimmed hats, with loose arms slightly raised and swinging as they ride. He represented every man's best secret image of himself, the honorable man, slicing clean through the rolling world of morals and machines. He isolated and enlarged to 6'3" an untainted strain of goodness in a very male specimen of the male of the species. Glen, Home and Dry. Guardian, 22 February 1962. The morning of Colonel Glen's 11th date with an orbit dawned without clouds over Cape Canaveral and without high waves off Bermuda. And so at last the 18 tracking stations around the globe, the recovery ships, the 1,500 expert watchers were alerted for a go, the syllable the American people have been waiting to exhale since the middle of December. A few miles away on Cocoa Beach, 5,000 people, hundreds of whom had slept in their cars by the seashore, set up radio and antennae, focused telescopes, rocked babies, and faced the rocket and his escape tower, and saw the colonel wave and waddle aboard. At 19 minutes after 8, a hatch bolt broke and was quickly replaced. 22 minutes before the 0 hour, there was a failure in one of the loading valves that feed liquid oxygen from the ground tanks into the rocket itself. In a rare burst of tact, Mercury Control did not report the slip until it was within a minute of being repaired. At 13.5 minutes to go, the helicopters at Canaveral began to spin their blades against the extreme possibility of an instantaneous recovery if the flight was aborted right after the takeoff. At 8 minutes, the last assurance squawked over the public address system. All systems go. At 6.5 minutes, an electrical power failure in the computer system at Bermuda was reported as restored. 2.5 minutes to go, the escape tower swung off. 20 seconds from the word, the umbilical cord dropped away, and Mercury Control intoned the countdown in seconds. There was the deep, low-frequency rumble modulating to an enormous whoosh of sound and a vicious tongue of flame. Soon the Atlas rocket was a fiery keyhole, and then an acorn, and then a snowflake. Within a minute or so, the army of workers at Canaveral and the 500-odd reporters had lost all visible connection with their personal project and were at one with the silent crowds on the Florida beaches, in railroad stations and airports from New York to Seattle, gaping in extraordinary silence at giant television screens and hearing the elated exchange between Glenn and Mercury Control. On trajectory, booster engines off, tower gone, go baby go, 5.8 cabin pressure holding. He was already 500 miles downrange in contact with Bermuda and off again across the Atlantic. More soaring waves of sound and static, and the bright baritone again. I can see the booster turning around. I feel fine. The view is tremendous. The next interval, and the Goddard Space Control Center unscrambled the telemeter chatter, and Mercury Control announced, "All systems go. Colonel Glenn is at the proper orbit angle." This, to Canaveral and the tracking stations, was the first crisis past, since the tiniest error in the liftoff could distort the orbit angle many thousands of times. In a new, reassuring official tone, Colonel John Powers, the Chief Information Officer at Mercury Control, announced that Glenn's velocity was 17,545 miles per hour, that he would orbit between a perigee of 100 miles and an apogee of 160 miles. For the next 80 minutes we learned to attach a precious value to the regular assurances on cabin pressure and oxygen. He mentioned some severe vibration after takeoff, but he plainly survived it. And by the time he was over Africa, we had heard that all his systems were in shape to sustain the theoretical 7 orbits. "All systems," he crowed, "go, and I am go. The capsule is in fine shape." The first and almost flawless recorded tape between Glenn and a tracking station was taken at Kano in Nigeria. He was very comfortable. "All systems okay. A beautiful view of the African coast." 9 minutes later he had made contact with Zanzibar, and 10 minutes later was high over the Indian Ocean. At Muchia in Australia, the same thing, and again at Woomera. He had been up an hour and 15 minutes when he was commanded to take a deep breath. He did so, and must have been relieved to hear from a doctor on the other side of the earth and the atmosphere that "Your medical status is excellent." He had already celebrated this suspicion by pumping some fruit paste and meat paste into his gullet from the toothpaste tubes they developed to overcome the problem of eating outside gravity. By the time he had completed his first orbit, in 1 hour, 56 minutes and 40 seconds, we heard a tape recorded as he had gone over Mexico. He was having some minor difficulty with the attitude control. It takes only 1 pound of thrust delivered by a hydrogen peroxide exhaust to keep the capsule yawing and rolling according to plan. The automatic control evidently failed, but he announced, with no audible concern, that he was successfully using a combination of manual and electrical control known as fly-by-wire. This mild concern began to nag both Colonel Glenn and Mercury Control as he took off on the second loop. And throughout that orbit, Mercury Control was contacting the tracking stations and getting the same reassuring but slightly sinister story from the astronaut. His automatic system was definitely out, but he was handling the capsule's attitude with the greatest of ease. A momentary pause from this fearful item was filled by the flashing word from Auburn, Maine, that it had named a street in his honor, and from St. Paul, Minnesota, that its latest school will be known as the John H. Glenn Junior High School. There were 2 frantic but well-disciplined minutes at Mercury Control when the decision had to be made to bring him down or let him go into the third orbit. They let him go, and the drama began to move to a tidy end as he spanned the Atlantic for a third time, and the North Atlantic Recovery Fleet disbanded. The curiosity now was all about the place of his landing, and while the tapes discussed nothing but the time to fire the 3 retro-rockets that would diminish his speed and bring him down, we were already hearing a cavernous cheer go up from the crew of the USS Randolph, which had been plotted as the probable rescue ship. Back in the capsule, Glenn was counting his chickens with jocular confidence. He told a groundling astronaut to get the cake ready, a 993-pound invitation to gastritis, exactly the dimensions of the capsule, 9 feet by 6 feet, that had been baked for the 27 January attempt and been embalmed in an air-conditioned truck ever since. Over Mukia again, he delivered a solemn message. "Hey, Gordon, get this over to General Shoup, the Marine Commandant. I have 4 hours required flight time. Request flight chit be prepared for me." All flyers get a bonus for 4 hours flying time a month. Colonel Glenn undoubtedly will be rewarded at the usual rate of pay. 3 times round the globe equals $245. There was only one other jolting moment before the smooth descent, the succession of parachutes, and the rescue by the destroyer Noah. Over the Pacific, he was having trouble deploying the heat shield, which pushes away the 3,000 degrees of heat when the rockets fire. This agony lasted for about 4 minutes, until he said over Hawaii that the switch had worked. It was the signal that was out. Then the rockets fired, no doubt about it. I felt it was going to send me clear back to Hawaii. The Randolph spotted the big parachutes through the clouds. The USS Noah was only 6 miles away. The helicopters went off like flying lobsters, and they saw him and the capsule in a rippling sea with a water temperature of 81 degrees. After that we switched to Washington, to the well-tempered president, then to the ecstatic parents, and to Grand Central Station and the dissolving crowds and strong men blowing their noses. John Glenn inscribed his name after the Wright brothers and Lindbergh. I am go. Marilyn Monroe, 1926 to 1962. Guardian, 6 August, 1962. Marilyn Monroe was found dead in bed this morning in her home in Hollywood. Only a physical mile or 2, but a social universe distant from the place where she was born 36 years ago as Norma Jean Baker. She died with a row of medicines and an empty bottle of barbiturates at her elbow. These stony sentences, which read like the epitaph of a Raymond Chandler victim, will confirm for too many millions of movie fans the usual melodrama of a humble girl, cursed by physical beauty, to be dazed and doomed by the fame that was too much for her. For Americans, the last chapter was written on the weekend that a respectable national picture magazine printed for the delectation of her troubled fans a confessional piece called Marilyn Monroe, pours out her soul. The plot of her early life is as seedy as anything in the pulp magazines, and to go into the details now would be as tasteless as prying into the clinical file of any other pretty woman whose beauty has crumbled overnight. It is enough, for summoning the necessary compassion, to recall her miserable parents, her being shuttled like a nuisance from foster home to orphanage, the subsequent knockabout years in a war factory, her short independence as a sailor's wife, the unsuspected first rung of the ladder provided by a posing job for a nude calendar. She talked easily about all this, when people had the gall to ask her, not as someone reconciled to a wretched childhood, but as a wide-eyed outsider, an innocent as foreign to the subject under discussion as Chaplin is when he stands off and analyzes the appeal of the little man. Then she wiggled briefly past the lecherous gaze of Louis Calhern in John Huston's Asphalt Jungle, and his appraising whinny echoed round the globe. Within 2 years she was the enthroned sexpot of the Western world. She completed the first phase of the American dream by marrying the immortal Joe DiMaggio, the loping hero of the New York Yankees, and the second phase by marrying Arthur Miller, and so redeeming his suspect Americanism at the moment it was in question before a House committee. To say that Marilyn Monroe was a charming, shrewd, and pathetic woman of tragic integrity will sound as preposterous to the outsider as William Empson's Freudian analysis of Alice in Wonderland. It is nevertheless true. We restrict the word integrity to people either simple or complex, who have a strong sense of righteousness or, if they are public men, of self-righteousness. Yet it surely means no more than what it says. Wholeness, being free to be spontaneous, without wreck of consistency or moral appearances. It can be as true of forlorn and bewildered people as of the disciplined and the solemn. In this sense, Marilyn Monroe was all of a piece. She was confused, pathologically shy, a straw on the ocean of her compulsions, to pout, to wisecrack, to love a stranger, to be 6 hours late, or lock herself in a room. She was a sweet and humorous person, increasingly terrified by the huge stereotype of herself she saw plastered all around her. The exploitation of this pneumatic, mocking, liquid-lipped goddess gave the world a simple picture of the Lorelei. She was about as much of a Lorelei as Bridget the housemaid. This orphan of the rootless city of the angels at last could feel no other identity than the one she saw in the mirror. A baffled, honest girl, forever haunted by the nightmare of herself, 60 feet tall and naked before a howling mob. She could never learn to acquire the lacquered shell of the prima donna or the armor of sophistication. So, in the end, she found the ultimate oblivion, of which her chronic late-comings and desperate retreats to her room were tokens. Meredith registered. The High Price. Guardian, 1 October 1962. James Meredith was registered this morning as a student at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, the town that in the last week was honored around the world as the hometown of Pulitzer Prize winner William Faulkner. So far, the price of Meredith's admission is the death of a foreign newsman and an Oxford youth, 50 injured and wounded, 93 arrests, the destruction of 7 army trucks and the damaging of 20 more, the bitter surrender of Governor Ross Barnett, the inflaming of the populace of Mississippi, and the calling out of 2,500 regular army infantrymen and military police. Not to gloss over the incalculable political liabilities, one ought to mention the heavy reprisals the Democrats may suffer in next month's congressional elections, and the forfeit of more Southern states in the presidential election of 1964, which President Kennedy has calculated and which the Republicans cannot help but count on, though at present in a secret and guilty fashion. Up to 7:30 last evening, when the President was supposed to address the nation, Governor Ross Barnett had given no public sign that he would yield. Then it was announced that the President had postponed his broadcast till 10 o'clock, and it was rightly guessed that a settlement was brewing. This rumour crackled among the crowds that had been milling around the Oxford Courthouse Square and set them moving toward the university campus, which was being guarded by the State Highway Patrol. When it became known that Meredith had been safely installed in a university apartment on the campus, the troubles began. It was soon too much for the patrolmen, and they gave way to 350 federal marshals who had set up a tent city out of town. Rocks and bottles and stink bombs were thrown at the university office building, and the gathering crowds of students, local citizens, and outlanders began to charge the marshals. By 8:30, the riots were getting so out of hand that the marshals put in a call to Memphis, an army base, for help from a military police battalion or the Mississippi National Guard, which President Kennedy federalized shortly after midnight yesterday. About 9 o'clock, Governor Barnett broadcast a statement, and many of the rioters heard it over transistor radios. The state of Mississippi, he declared, was now completely surrounded by armed forces, and we are physically overpowered. He assured his fellow Mississippians that my courage and my convictions do not waver, but my calm judgment abhors the bloodshed that would follow. He urged all Mississippians and every state officer under my command to do everything in their power to preserve peace and to avoid violence in any form. After condemning the United States for converting the 10,000 good Mississippians in the National Guard into federal troops who are now required to oppose me and their own people, he invoked the mercy of God on the federal government for tramping on the sovereignty of this great state and depriving it of every vestige of honor and respect. An hour later, the President appeared on all the TV and radio networks with a quite different definition of the honor of Mississippi and the United States. He appealed to the people of Mississippi to uphold federal law, to accept a federal judgment that might be difficult for them. He paid lyrical tribute to the courage and the learning of Mississippians and their prowess in the Second World War and in Korea, and even on the football field. The courage of Mississippi would now be tested by its willingness to accept those laws with which you disagree. The eyes of the nation and all the world are upon you and upon all of us, and the honor of your university and state are in the balance. This healing talk, which made no capital or mention of Governor Barnett's surrender, reassured the listening millions. But Oxford responded with massive lunges at the embattled marshals, who now had one man severely wounded and several others out of action. By midnight, several hundred people from out of town or out of state had joined the mob. Among them was former Major General Edwin Walker, the cashiered commander of the troops who integrated Little Rock. He urged the rioters to protest, protest, keep it up. At 1 this morning, 200 military police at last came in from Memphis, and federal troops made their first intervention. It was what the President and the marshals had dreaded. The campus and its buildings were clouded with tear gas, and a 9-hour battle was under way. It was not over until the Mississippi National Guard, including Negro soldiers who offered the rioters their most detested targets, had joined the MPs, and until the word got round that 2,500 regular army, police, and infantrymen were converging on the city. By then, Paul Guillard of Agence France-Presse and one Ray Gunter of Abbeville, Mississippi, were dead, and the campus was a shambles. Not until 5:30 this morning did President Kennedy hear that the worst of the night was over. He went to bed. At 6 a.m., the commanding officer of the Federals reported that the campus was secure. The Justice Department said today that it was possible that many of the 93 persons arrested might be charged with insurrection, which could entail 20 years in prison and a £20,000 fine for each conviction. A possible culprit, the department admitted, might be General Walker, whom Senator Wayne Morse, Democrat, castigated this morning on the Senate floor as a sick man who ought to be committed. There was no disposition today, either in the Justice Department or in the Memphis Army headquarters, to believe that this battle is the end of the war. Meredith was solemnly registered this morning. Tomorrow he will have to go to classes. The next day and the next he will need protection. The Army might have a unit stationed there for months. After that, as one sad commentator mused last night, he is not likely to lead a carefree life. Ultimatum to USSR. Letter number 741, 28 October 1962. Today was, on this seaboard, another jewel of a day. One of those New York days that are almost as crystalline in January as they are in June or October. Like many millions of other people, I put the clock back last evening in order to justify staying up later than usual. A couple of friends came in. The man a member of the United Nations Secretariat, and between bouts of personal talk we tuned in the bulletins every half hour in the hope, which seemed last midnight to be draining away, that the United States would not feel it essential to have to use force to destroy the Russian missile bases in Cuba. More photographs were coming into the Pentagon and being rushed to the White House, and they showed that way down below, the Russian technicians and their Cuban help had been working overtime on Friday and Saturday to finish the bases and mount the missiles and confront the United States with a dreadful accomplished fact, which the President, in the long, long week behind us, had labored to thwart. The bulletins last night kept breaking into the rock and roll and the melancholy vibra-harps all through the night. But there comes a point when anxiety must have a stop. And the last two items we heard were that the President had turned down Mr. Khrushchev's offer to trade his Cuban bases for our Turkish ones. More numbing still, that Mr. Adlai Stevenson, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, had told the delegates of 13 nations, from NATO and Latin America mostly, that unless work on the missile bases was voluntarily stopped, the United States would take military action to eliminate them in exactly 48 hours. It was interesting, to say the least, that this apparently ultimate warning, the very last step of brinkmanship, was given not by the President or the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, but by Ambassador Stevenson, a man who, to paraphrase a famous complaint of Marshal Foch, is a man very well known, but still Ambassador Stevenson. In other words, a courier or servant of presidential policy, certainly not its maker, a fact that Mr. Stevenson has sometimes found hard to accept, since only 2 years ago he seemed a grander figure than the Senator Kennedy who was about to become president. I ought to point out that Mr. Stevenson was the man who, in April of last year, went before the Security Council of the United Nations and defended with passionate sincerity the good faith of the United States, who honestly ridiculed the Soviet charge that the invasion of Cuba, which was then in its earlier stages, had been planned and assisted by the United States. He brought in photo exhibits of captured planes, whose markings showed that they were from Castro's Air Force. Unfortunately, it came out later that similar markings had been faked on planes used in the invasion. In a word, the Khrushchev administration had faked the planes and used Ambassador Stevenson as an honest dupe. Mr. Stevenson had a rough time of it then and afterwards from Mr. Valerian Sorin, the Soviet chief delegate, and Mr. Stevenson had no public way open to him to recover his self-respect. for he had made his honest defense of American motives before he was informed that the abortive invasion was in fact an American show. Mr. Zorin brought this up with relish on Thursday evening, when once again Mr. Stevenson brought easels and photographic blow-ups into the Security Council and mounted them and described them, in order to force the answer to the question Mr. Stevenson had hammered at Mr. Zorin, and which Mr. Zorin airily waved away. That question, in Mr. Stevenson's words, was, "Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no?" Mr. Stevenson is a man of great dignity and patience, but Mr. Zorin's face began to crack, somewhere between a smirk and a sigh, and in that split second Mr. Stevenson leaned forward and rasped out, "Don't wait for the interpretation. Yes or no?" Mr. Zorin replied that he was not in an American courtroom and had no wish to answer a prosecutor's question. "You'll get your answer," he said, without deigning to look at the now crouching figure of Stevenson. "Don't worry." It was at that moment that Mr. Stevenson leaned even further forward and said a sentence that will surely, if only from its repetition in film clips, pass into the lexicon of famous American phrases like "Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes" and "You may fire when ready, Mr. Gridley." "I am prepared," Mr. Stevenson rasped out, "to wait for an answer till hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room," which he promptly did. Now, in all the long and tortuous sequence of events since the President cancelled his Midwest campaign tour on account of that strategic cold in the head, this seems to me, to coin a phrase, the moment of truth. It was the moment that lots of thoughtful people on both sides of the Atlantic were waiting for. It was the root question they wanted to pluck up and have answered. Mr. Zorin refused to look at the photographs that everybody else was eyeing like eagles. If I'd been talking to you 2 days ago, I should have gone into the detail of those pictures and reported the reliable assurance of high-altitude photographers, military and Air Force reconnaissance men, and not only Americans, that a trained and disinterested eye was bound to see in them, shot over Candelaria and San Cristobal and Guanahai, unmistakable missile sites and missile equipment and accessories that can be used for no other known military purpose. Since, however, we are talking on Sunday evening, there is no need to stress the point that the chances of these pictures being of cunning camouflage or clever movie sets are about 1 in 1,000. The military say the chances are much less. Mr. Zorin at the time was simply obedient to his instructions. "Falsity," he shouted, "is what the United States has in its hands. False evidence, forgeries." Between then and now, Mr. Khrushchev himself has given the lie to Mr. Zorin's lie. Only this morning, Mr. Khrushchev said to the President, "The weapons you describe as offensive are grim weapons. You and I both know that they are." It is almost a parrot echo of Mr. Stevenson's well-bred snort at the end of Thursday's crackling exchange in the Security Council. "I hope we can stop this sparring. We know the facts, and so do you, sir." You may have gathered from this tremendous scene, which will never be forgotten by those who saw it, that Mr. Stevenson was the logical man to enunciate last night's warning, since he is the man who has carried the American case in the United Nations, the one place where the Soviet Union, the United States, and Cuba are meeting face to face. It is logical, but it is not inevitable. All exchanges with foreign governments, and even with Bertrand Russell, have been handled by the President. It was left to Mr. Stevenson to give yesterday's warning, to say that the first move would be an airstrike, because it was essential for the credibility of the United States before the rest of the world to show that this time Stevenson was in on the most secret information, that he knew, that he believed, and that this time he spoke with both knowledge and good faith. When the history of this, the longest week, comes to be written, I think that the decision to entrust an ambassador, and this ambassador, with the final warning, will be seen to be a masterstroke of diplomacy and goodwill. Below the surface of even the most world-shaking political events, the actors remember old grudges. The role that Mr. Stevenson was asked to play, or by default was allowed to play, in the Bay of Pigs disaster, was humiliating to him, and damaging to the honesty of the Kennedy administration in its first showdown with communism in this hemisphere. But in the second, the much more momentous showdown, since it was not between a giant and the other giant's puppet, but between the titans themselves, it was crucial that nobody should infer a clash of wills inside the Kennedy cabinet. When we went to bed last night, we had this small and honourable satisfaction to set against the immensity of the risk, the trembling of the fingers on the nuclear buttons. When we woke up this morning, the glad tidings came pealing in, breaking into Mozart and Gilbert and Sullivan, and solemn sermons and rollicking hymns up in Harlem. The news that Mr. Khrushchev had accepted unconditionally every point of Mr. Kennedy's demand for the dismantling of the Cuban missile bases under UN supervision. We had to wait 4 more hours, by which time the Khrushchev text had been studied at the White House, before, not much more than an hour ago, the President came through with his warm welcome for this contribution to peace, and his earnest hope that the governments of the world will turn now to the compelling necessity of ending the arms race. This is not the time to review the last week, to mete out blame and recrimination, or study the furious diplomacy of the last 7 days as a possibly perilous precedent for a similar crisis over, say, Berlin. I can only say that if the conditions are met, President Kennedy will emerge in his own country incredibly strengthened as a president and leader. An hour ago, a neighbour of mine, who is a hi-fi buff and mighty proud of an amplifier that practically fills the building, telephoned me and asked me to listen to the raging sound of his gramophone. He was playing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." It was corny, but it was spontaneous and good, and I looked out over the riffling waves of the reservoir in Central Park. A bird rose from the water and was airborne and soared off to the ocean. I should like to say it was a dove. It was, however, a seagull, whose clean, swinging flight I shall remember till the day I die. Questioning the President. Letter number 781, 4 August 1963. On Thursday afternoon, as I was sitting looking out across the reservoir in Central Park, fishing in my mind for some missing adjective, I saw the most curious thing. For days the sky had kept that cloudless, leaden, absolutely featureless quality of our sky when we are having great heat. Now, quite suddenly, and without any clouds moving in, the sky began to get some colour, as if some enormous dye was slowly seeping into it. It intensified to what we used to call a battleship grey, then to a deep lead. And by now, the pigeons and gulls in the park, which had been soaring lazily around, began to get panicky and wheel and squeal. It went darker still, and I was unable to read the few lines I'd written with my typewriter. I went and got a camera and threw open the window. The air outside is much hotter these days than any air inside, however suffocating, so it's better at all times to keep the windows shut. And I focused on the high twin towers of an apartment building across the park. I'd clicked the shutter when a sort of shiver ran across the glassy surface of the reservoir. Then the trees in the park shuddered and waved madly, and without any other warning, The rain came slamming so hard and so fast that I had a time getting the window down and locking it. Then I heard another noise, a gurgling sound, and there at my feet was a rising pool. The rain was rolling in across the vent between the top of the radiator and the outside sill. And so it was in 2 other rooms. I rushed off to a linen closet and picked up half a dozen bath towels and flung them on the floor beneath the 3 windows. It was all over in 10 minutes, and the bath towels oozed. The sky broke up, and little clouds appeared, the first, it seemed, in weeks, and the thermometer nose-dived. And at last we were out of the soaking high 90s. And the next morning the Weather Bureau was able to announce, with almost a croon, its usual summer forecast. Tomorrow, fair and comfortable, seasonable temperatures, high about 84 degrees. Next morning I drew the attention of a weatherman to a small headline in a London paper, Airmail edition. It said, 75 degrees, another scorcher! ! Well, said the weatherman philosophically, only goes to prove one man's scorcher is another man's comfort. Without wanting to squeeze a moral out of this line, I couldn't help thinking of it when someone interviewed a Negro who'd been lying down in the street day after day as part of the organized picketing of 2 housing projects and a hospital construction site in New York. They're protesting against discrimination in the building trades. The reporter suggested, what I think must have occurred to a lot of people, that the Negroes who are demonstrating and picketing and sitting down and lying down, and in general running the risk of arrest and prison, not to mention getting their heads broken, that such people are a special breed of men and women, either specially brave or specially reckless. The coloured man was unimpressed by this suggestion. He replied in much the same vein as many a war hero. Well, he said, at first you're scared witless, then the day comes when having a couple of cops pick you up and carry you off gets to be kind of snug. Snug or not, thousands and thousands of Negroes who once used to say nothing and fume inwardly are now ready to march and rally and risk their safety and that of their young to get what they were given on paper 100 years ago. You will have noticed how impossible it is, even if one tried, to write a letter from America without bringing in the Negro. It would, in fact, be as odd as writing a letter from Noah's Ark without mentioning the wind and the waves. I've been looking back at the President's press conferences in the past 6 months. There has never been a time when he wasn't challenged at least once on some aspect of the racial question. On Wednesday, it came up in a form so familiar to generations of blacks and whites that it was a marvel this particular point had never been made before, at least to the President. It was put by a lady who has been going to presidential press conferences since the early days of Roosevelt. Her name is Miss May Craig, and she writes for a paper in Portland, Maine. She never, to any president, asks soothing questions or flattering questions. They are not exactly needling, but they usually bring up some knotty, awkward problem that is on everybody's mind. On the mind, anyway, of the average laconic New Englander, of the hardy, sceptical Yankee type that is still around in large numbers and that doesn't waste words. Well, Miss Craig, she is really a widow, in her 60s, who's been a newspaper woman for over 40 years, but she's Miss Craig to everybody, is a worthy daughter of this tight-lipped Yankee tradition. The fact, which I whisper, that she was born in South Carolina does not in any way detract from her standing as a professional Yankee. She has served the newspapers of Maine long and faithfully, and, like most people who become identified as the symbol of a particular place, she came from somewhere else. Napoleon, remember, was not a Frenchman, nor was Hitler a German. Well, Miss Craig stood up and put to President Kennedy this highly uncomfortable question. Mr. President, in some 24 states there are, all over the country, there are miscegenation intermarriage laws in various forms. The California courts once found them unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment and said that marriage is a fundamental right of free men. Now, in your crusade against racial discrimination for all races, will you seek to abrogate these laws, and how would you go about it? This was a loaded question. Miss Craig was blithely asking what everybody thinks and nobody says aloud, namely the old chestnut, but one that cannot be airily dismissed by anybody. Would you like your sister to marry a Negro? To give you the exact tone of the President's reply, I should have to be a consummate actor, because all that the transcript shows is that he was sufficiently thrown to be pretty inarticulate. But I'll try anyway. This is what the transcript shows. Well, the law would, if there was a marriage of the kind you described, I would assume that, and if any legal action was taken against the party, then they would have a relief, it would seem to me, in the courts, and it would be carried, I presume, to the higher courts, depending on the judgment, so that the laws themselves would be affected by the ultimate decision of the Supreme Court. Not surprisingly, this didn't satisfy Miss Craig, for he was ducking his own opinion and saying, in effect, it would be up to the Supreme Court. Miss Craig stayed on her feet. She said, "Can't the Department of Justice take some discrimination cases to the courts themselves?" The President paused again, and the auditorium was very quiet. "I'm not sure," he said. "I'm not sure they could, as you describe it, because I'm not sure they would be a party in the case. It would probably be an order to have the case heard, and this is a legal matter about which I'm not familiar with, and I speak with the valor of ignorance, as I'm not a lawyer. I would think there'd have to be a party at interest who would bring the suit. Now he was looking up and down. Which party? Who do you have in mind? He seemed to be wondering. Then he pulled himself out of this flounder with a typical swift and cunning little stroke that released a great burst of laughter on the last few words. "But this is a matter which I'd be glad to have the Attorney General or the Solicitor General speak to you personally about, Miss Craig." Miss Craig flopped down in the ocean of laughter, and the President was saved once again by his very wry humour. Of course, it's no laughing matter. It is, in raw fact, the secret mainspring of, I should say, most middle-aged fear of the ultimate consequences of integration. While we wrestle every day with this great rebellion, it is very humbling, or it may at least be very enlightening, to discover that the cast of characters in this national debate is by now so well understood by the Negro himself that he has developed a whole lexicon of slang to describe them. We are indebted, I hope, to Time magazine for having dug out this ruthless and fascinating index to the mind of the black man, whose troubles most of us, no matter what our point of view, pretend to understand. Well, when there are enough folk who feel deeply about something to spawn a slang phrase, there you have a genuine piece of folklore, and I believe this little dictionary of slang might give us all profitable pause about the purity, the intelligence, and the sophistication of our own motives. We have all known for some time that the contemporary American Negro refers to the quiet, subservient Negro of the old tradition, and refers to him with contempt, as Uncle Tom. It is now applied to all these Negroes who warn against violence, either from their personal disposition or religious conviction or whatever. Mr. Tom is a middle-class Tom, and a colored woman who urges moderation is called Aunt Thomasina. Understandably, Negroes who are working toward the day of deliverance realize acutely that their cause is damaged by hoodlums or flashy types. They call them butterheads. They maintain a keen suspicion of Negroes who are acceptable to whites as negotiators. They are called clean, safe, and certified. The Negroes who preach militancy but stop short of violence are dubbed upside-downers. A demonstrator who has not enjoyed his baptism of fire by being jailed is called an untouchable, and one who stands aside from the civil rights movement is a sleeping beauty. There is little point in retailing the rest of this astute and ruthless lingo, for the Negroes are alert to the instinct of bright white sympathizers who try and get hip to this argot by adopting it. With a mild sneer, one Negro says, "When it's hip among whites, it's already square among Negroes." There really seems to be no place for us to go, does there? No place, at any rate, acceptable to the Negro as the decent, responsible place for an intelligent, humane, sympathetic white who would like to see the Negro win and enjoy his constitutional rights. You know, in fact, what they call such people as you and I, white, sympathetic liberals? They call us innocents. President Kennedy assassinated. Guardian, 22 November 1963. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was shot during a motorcade drive through downtown Dallas this afternoon. He died in the emergency room of the Parkland Memorial Hospital 32 minutes after the attack. He was 46 years old. He is the third president to be assassinated in office since Abraham Lincoln, and the first since President McKinley in 1901. In the late afternoon, the Dallas police took into custody a former Marine, one Lee Harvey Oswald, aged 24, who is alleged to have shot a policeman outside a theater. He is said to have remarked only, "It's all over now." He is the chairman of a group called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and is married to a Russian girl. He is described at the moment as a prime suspect. The new president is the vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a 55-year-old native Texan who took the oath of office in Dallas at 5 minutes to 4 at the hands of a woman judge, and later arrived in Washington with the body of the dead president. This is being written in the numbed interval between the first shock and the harried attempt to reconstruct a sequence of fact from an hour of tumult. However, this is the first assassination of a world figure that took place in the age of television, and every network and station in the country took up the plotting of the appalling story. It begins to form a grisly pattern, contradicted by a grisly preface. The projection on television screens of a happy crowd and a grinning president only a few seconds before the gunshots. The president was almost at the end of his 2-day tour of Texas. He was to make a lunch speech in the Dallas Trade Mart building, and his motor procession had about another mile to go. He had had the warmest welcome of his trip from a great crowd at the airport. The cries and pleas for a personal touch were so engaging that Mrs. Kennedy took the lead and walked from the ramp of the presidential plane to a fence that held the crowd in. She was followed quickly by the president, and they both seized hands and forearms and smiled gladly at the people. The Secret Service and the police were relieved to get them into their car, where Mrs. Kennedy sat between the president and John B. Connally, the governor of Texas. The Dallas police had instituted the most stringent security precautions in the city's history. They wanted no repetition of the small but disgraceful brawl that humiliated Adlai Stevenson in their city when he attended a United Nations rally on 24 October. The motorcade was going along slowly but smoothly. 3 muffled shots, which the crowd first mistook for fireworks, cracked through the cheers. One hit the shoulder blade and the wrist of Governor Connally, who was taken with the president to the hospital, where his condition is serious. The other brought blood trickling from the back of the sitting president's head. His right arm flopped from a high wave of greeting, and he collapsed into the arms of Mrs. Kennedy, who fell unharmed. She was heard to cry, "Oh, no," and sat there all the way, cradling his head in her lap. As some people bayed and screamed, and others fell to the ground and hid their faces, the Secret Service escort broke into two groups, one speeding the President's car to the hospital, and another joined a part of the heavy police escort in wheeling off in pursuit of a man fleeing across some railroad tracks. Nothing came of this lead. The President was taken to the emergency room of the Parkland Hospital, and Governor Connolly was taken into the surgery. Mrs. Kennedy went in with the living President, and less than an hour later came out with the dead man in a bronze coffin, which arrived shortly after two priests had administered the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church. The body was escorted by Generals Clifton and McHugh, the President's chief military and Air Force aides, to the Dallas airport, and flown thence to Washington. Within an hour of the President's death, the Secret Service had found a sniper's nest inside the building from which the first witnesses swore the bullets had been fired. It is a warehouse for a school textbook firm, known as the Texas School Depository, on the corner of Elm and Houston Streets. In an upper room, whose open window commanded the route of the presidential motorcade, the servicemen found the remains of a fried chicken and a foreign-made rifle with a telescopic sight. Alongside it lay 3 empty cartridges. The Assassination. Letter number 794, 24 November 1963. By now it may well be impossible to add any sensible or proper words to all the millions that have been written and spoken about the life and cruel death of John F. Kennedy. Those of us who have ever sat down to write a letter of condolence to a close friend know what an aching task it is to say something that is pointed and that touches the right vein of sympathy. But I hope you will understand that there is no other thing to talk about, not here. At 3,000 miles it may be easier to speculate about policy, the new administration. Not here. For I cannot remember a time, certainly in the last 30 years, when the people everywhere around you were so quiet, so tired-looking, and for all their variety of shape and colour and character, so plainly the victims of a huge and bitter disappointment. Now, that may sound a queer word to use, but grief is a general term that covers all kinds of sorrow. And I think that what sets off this death from that of other great Americans of our time is the sense that we have been cheated, in a moment, by a wild but devilishly accurate stroke of the promise of what we had begun to call the age of Kennedy. Let me remind you of a sentence in his inaugural address when he took over the presidency on that icy day of 20 January 1961. He said, "Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty." This is, of course, the finest rhetoric, worthy of Lincoln. But what made it sound so brave and rousing on that first day was the clear statement that a young man was speaking for a new generation. It concentrated in one scornful sentence the reminder that the old men who had handled the uncertain peace and the Second World War had had their day, and that there was at hand a band of young Americans ready not to ignore the wisdom of their forefathers, but to fight for it. It would be hard to say more exactly or more bravely that it was a fresh America that would have to be negotiated with, but that, as always, liberty itself was not negotiable. Now, even in the moment of knowing that the promises of an inaugural address are bound to have a grandeur very hard to live up to the morning after, this remarkable speech, which the President had hammered out sentence by sentence with his closest aide and companion, Theodore Sorensen, did strike a note to which the American people and their allies everywhere responded with great good cheer. Of course, we knew, older men and women have always known, what in their youth they blithely rattled off as a quotation from Shakespeare, that golden lads and girls all must, as chimney-sweepers, come to dust. But it is always stirring to see that young people don't believe it. We chuckled sympathetically then at the warning that Senator Lyndon Johnson had chanted all through the campaign, that the presidency could not safely be put in the hands of a man who has not a touch of gray in his hair. John Kennedy had turned the tables triumphantly on this argument by saying, in effect, that in a world shivering under the bomb, it was the young who had the vigor and the single-mindedness to lead. If we pause and run over the record of the very slow translation of these ideals into law, the hair-breadth defeat of the medical care for the aged plan, the shelving, after a year of labor, of the tax bill, the perilous reluctance of the Congress to tame the Negro Revolution now with a civil rights law, we have to admit that the clear trumpet sound of the Kennedy inaugural has been sadly soured down 3 short years. Any intelligent American family sitting around a few weeks ago would grant these deep disappointments, and many thoughtful men were beginning to wonder if the President's powers were not a mockery of his office, since he can be thwarted from getting any laws passed at all by the simple obstructionism of a dozen chairmen of congressional committees, most of them by the irony of a seniority system that gives more and more power to old men who keep getting re-elected by the same states, most of them from the South. But that same American family, sitting around this weekend, could live with these disappointments, but not with the great one, the sense that the new generation, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, unwilling to witness or permit, was struck down lifeless, unable to witness or permit or not to permit anything. When it is possible to be reasonable, we will all realize, calling on our everyday fatalism, that if John Kennedy was 46 and his brother Robert only 38, most of the men around him were in their 50s and some in their 60s, and that therefore we fell for a day or two in November 1963 into a sentimental fit. However, we are not yet reasonable. The self-protective fatalism, which tells most of us that what has been must be, has not yet restored us to the humdrum course of life. I am not dwelling on this theme, the slashing down in a wanton moment of the flower of youth, because it's enjoyable or poetic to think about. It seems to me, looking over the faces of the people and hearing my friends, that the essence of the American mood this very dark weekend is this deep feeling that our youth has been mocked, and the vigor of America, for the moment, paralyzed. It is, to be hard-hearted about it, fascinating, when it is not also poignant, to see in how many ways people express the same emotion. Many of the memorial photographs in the shop windows have small replicas of the presidential standard on one side and a Navy flag on the other, recalling the incredible 5 days' gallantry on that Pacific island that Kennedy himself never recalled, except to the men who were with him and survived. A young socialite, whose life is a round of clothes and parties and music, bemoans the fact that the Kennedys will leave the White House and take with them the style, the grace, the fun they brought to it. An American friend from Paris writes, "I think his death will especially be felt by the young, for he had become for them a symbol of what was possible with intelligence and will." An old man, wise in the ups and downs of politics, says, "I wonder if we knew what he might have grown to in the second term." A child with wide eyes asks, "Tell me, will the Peace Corps go on?" There is another thing that strikes me which is allied to the idea of a young lion shot down. It is best seen in the bewilderment of people who were against him, who felt he had temporized and betrayed the promise of the first days. One of them, a politically active woman, rang me up, and what she had to say dissolved in tears. Another, a veteran sailor, a close friend, and a lifelong Republican, said last night, "I can't understand. I never felt so close to Kennedy as I do now." This sudden discovery that he was more familiar than we knew is, I think, easier to explain. He was the first president of the television age, not as a matter of chronology, but in the incessant use he made of this new medium. When he became president-elect, he asked a friend to prepare a memorandum on the history of presidential press conferences. He wanted to know how much the succession of presidents since Wilson had been able to mold the press conference, and how much it had molded them. What he received was a plea, disguised as a monograph, to abandon Eisenhower's innovation of saying everything on the record for quotation and letting the conference be televised. He looked it over at his usual rate of about 1,000 words a minute, granted the arguments, but said simply, "Television is now the main personal link between the people and the White House. We can't go back." He allowed his press conferences to be televised live. He also made another decision that ran counter to the wisdom of all incumbent presidents. No man who is in power invites a debate with an opponent who is out of power and who can speak not of the things he's done, but of the things the incumbent has done wrong. In spite of knowing well that next time he would be the man with his back against the wall, he had decided that the television debate was now an essential element of a presidential campaign. So, for 3 years and more, we have seen him, at the end of our day, on all his tours, in Vienna, in Dublin, in Berlin, in Florida, Chicago, Palm Beach, in, alas, Dallas. In his own house, talking affably with reporters, rumpling up the children, very rarely posing, always offhand and about his business, talking to foreign students in the White House garden, making sly, dry jokes at dinners. Every other week, fencing shrewdly and often brilliantly with 200 reporters, and sometimes, at formal rallies, stabbing the air with his forefinger and bringing to life again, in his eyes and his chin and his soaring sentences, the old image of the young warrior who promised the energy, the faith, the devotion that will light America and all who serve her. The consequence of all this is that the family, the American family, has been robbed violently and atrociously of a member. When Roosevelt died, the unlikeliest people, the very young who thought of him as a perpetual president, and some of the very old who hated him, confessed that they felt they had lost a father. Today, millions of Americans are baffled by the feeling, which seems to have little to do with their political loyalties, that they have lost a brother. The bright young brother you are proud of, the one who went far and mingled with the great, and had no side, no pomp, and in the worst moments the Bay of Pigs took all the blame, and in the best, the Cuban crisis, had the best sort of courage, which is the courage to face the worst and take a quiet stand. This charming, complicated, subtle, and greatly intelligent man, whom the Western world was proud to call its leader, appeared for a split second in the telescopic sight of a maniac's rifle, and he was snuffed out. In that moment, all the decent grief of a nation was taunted and outraged, so that along with the sorrow there is a desperate and howling note over the land. We may pray on our knees, but when we get up from them, we cry with the poet, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." LBJ, the 36th President. Guardian, 28 November 1963. It is hard to describe the appearance and personality of President Lyndon Baines Johnson in any words that would mean the same thing to readers of different nationalities. To say that he is 55, just over 14 stone, 6 foot 3 inches, clean-shaven, has crinkly, quizzical eyes and a blue-rimmed chin, is about as objective and blank a description as one could give. It only begins to acquire life through the lens of the observer's preconceptions. Thus, in a French paper, he is an earthy yet dapper son of le Far West. In a score of northern tabloids he is a rangy, backslapping Texan. To an English politician he is one of those ingratiating, shrewd Southern types the Senate seems to breed. Because he decided 10 years ago that segregation is doomed, most Southern conservatives look on him darkly as the native son who betrayed the Southland. To Texans of liberal bent, and there are many, he is an easy combination of sentimental New Dealer and smooth operator in oil, ranching, natural gas, and insurance. To the Congress he is quite simply Lyndon, the supreme strategist of the Senate in their day, an alternately engaging and terrifying figure on Capitol Hill, who, in the ironical progression of American politics, achieved the honor of the vice-presidency and got lost in its tomb-like vacuum, although every succeeding president swears to transform the office into that of an active deputy commander. Somehow the system can accommodate only one leader, and the vice-president becomes a powerless poobah, a ceremonial courier, a certain attender of funerals in Addis Ababa. It is from this hallowed void that, like 7 other accidental presidents before him, Lyndon Johnson has now been plucked to assume the supreme command. He comes to it from a background about as far removed from that of John Fitzgerald Kennedy as Boston, the terminal for immigrant Irishmen, is from Stonewall, Texas, where, until very recently, the shooting of an unarmed man who made threats was legally interpreted as justifiable self-defense. Both of them, however, were the grandsons of practicing politicians, and the gap between the farmer's son and the second-generation Ivy Leaguer was bridged when they came to Washington by the politician's code of teamsmanship and party loyalty. The contrast between a boy who taught in school to Mexicans and Negroes and a boy who had his own car in Palm Beach shriveled before the same tough facts of political life. The means whereby campaign funds are raised, a city machine is disciplined, a winning coalition is forged at the expense of personal friendships. It was this bond that made them close and admiring allies in the Senate. It was the reason why Kennedy, surveying the disorder and dissension of the South in 1960, picked Johnson to save it by wheedling, cajoling, and bullying its leaders in the last weeks of the last campaign. Johnson was born to a small farm and few comforts. At the age of 9, he was a shoeshine boy in a barber shop. At 15, he had left school for a road-building gang, and went from there to California by way of odd jobs in garages, lunch counters, and hotels. He came back to Texas, having been convinced in his odd moments that formal education was not the sissy frill he had been led to think. He worked his way through the Southwest State Teachers College at San Marcos, Texas, and 3.5 years later took a BSc degree. One endowment that simply required polishing was his gift of the gab, and it should be no surprise to anyone who has seen him woo and win an audience that in his early 20s he was a teacher of public speaking and debating. In 1931, he decided to go into politics as a political secretary to a Texas congressman. In Washington, the engaging young man with the dark eyes and the energy of a Mustang came under the eye of Franklin Roosevelt, who became, from then on, in Johnson's special phrase, a daddy to me. In 1937, he scraped into the congressional seat of a dead congressman, and the next year was elected to his own term. In 1948, the year of Harry Truman's miraculous reincarnation, he slipped into the Senate by 87 votes. The rest of the story is his rise as Democratic whip to the leadership of the party on the Senate floor. To those who had watched him calculate the possible and contrive the impossible, it was the inevitable mating of a round peg in a round hole. At this moment of hasty recall, political reporters remember him most vividly as the Senate leader who kept a mental file on the men who balked him, who yet liquidated old enmities in an unflagging gift for compromise. They reflect that there are not many senators, even now, who are not beholden to him, and they hope that in some way, never yet discovered by a congressman translated to the White House, he will be able to mesmerize the legislative arm of government that was set up as his watchdog. What is more plausible to anticipate is the strengthening of his instinct for compromise, for his whole professional life has been lived in the rooted belief that politics is one long accommodation of contesting forces. This conviction has often made him contemptuous of the liberal Jeremiahs. What matters, he used to swear, is not the throbbing speech, though no one can throb in better iambic pentameters, but the bill that emerges. Not the scarifying abuse of McCarthy, but the contriving of his censure on the floor of the Senate. As what he honestly regards as the supreme American issue of the day, the civil rights of the Negro, not the sword, but the guarantee that it shall not cleave the nation in two. So, to look over the last chapter of his active record with a cold eye, he catered to the North by steering through the Senate, with considerable courage, the first civil rights bill in 100 years. And while he first tried to redeem himself in the horrified South by protecting its rights to filibuster, he saw with the same delayed but irrevocable dishonesty that the filibuster must soon go, and he so incensed his fellow Southerners again by cautiously restricting the right of unlimited debate. Until a few years ago, his glaring liability as a president for the 1960s seemed to be his vague, baffled view of foreign affairs. Indochina he thought to be a futile war. Algeria was a remote nuisance. The contested islands of Quemoy and Matsu, the proud ramparts we must watch. Africa and Asia were growing suburbs. But nothing could be more unfair than to leave him with this air of a petulant provincial onlooker. In the last 3 years he sat in with President Kennedy through all the worst hours of the Bay of Pigs, Berlin, the missile crisis, South Vietnam, the McNamara-Pentagon feud, and the rest. "The President," he said a couple of years ago, "carries heavier burdens than I ever envisioned. You feel goose pimples coming up on your back." Because he is a doggedly untheoretical man, he has a capacity to digest unpleasant facts beyond his early experience. "I hate this thing as much as you do," he once shouted at a Senate colleague, "but this is what is happening." What he has lately discovered is happening is the enfranchisement of Africa, the revolt of Asia against the white man, the feudal upheaval of Latin America, the yearning of democratic Europe for self-reliance. Luckily, in ceremonial line of duty, he has visited most of the Allies, as also Scandinavia and the Middle East, and is personally acquainted with some of the African leaders. He has declared himself most pungently on 3 great issues. On civil rights, the words of the Declaration of Independence do not need to be further interpreted. They need to be implemented for all Americans. On the United Nations, it is very necessary. We would be at war without it. On peace, reciprocity is the key. If the Soviets want America's cooperation, they can earn it. If the Soviets want American hostility, they can certainly provoke it. In the melancholy waiting interval between the Requiem and the inauguration, there are few certainties about the Johnson administration. One of them is that he will take hold, and though the high style of the Kennedy regime is gone forever, as the White House reverts to the folksier manner of the country courthouse square, it will not surprise the friends of Lyndon Johnson if he emerges as a second Harry Truman, who arrived blinking in the White House one day, a failed haberdasher needing all our prayers, and the next sprang fully armed as a brave, irascible, all-American legionnaire, and, more astonishing still, a 20th-century statesman. Coming Through. Letter number 799, 29 December 1963. "The carols," wrote an old New York writer, "have not drowned out the Requiem." I guess that puts it about as simply and truly as it can be said. But they made a brave try, once the mournful 30 days was over and the flags were hoisted to the tops of their masts. On the last day, last Saturday, I went across the Potomac River, which separates Washington from the state of Virginia, and went up the hill into Arlington National Cemetery. It is surely one of the most beautiful of cemeteries, planted on one of the noblest sites. Its 400 acres describe a crescent-shaped plateau that slopes down across lawns and flower-beds to the Potomac. From any of its 10 gates, the road leads uphill to the top of a hill and the Doric columns and portico of a mansion once lived in by General Robert E. Lee. The cemetery was first laid out for the dead of the Union armies. As often happens with well-laid plans, the first man to be buried there was a Southerner, a Confederate soldier. He was only the first of many, and all the Confederates now lie on high ground to the west in a meadow known as Jackson Circle. All the leaves had gone from the trees last Saturday, and it was possible to stand almost anywhere on the sloping ground and look around the crescent from the north and the west to the south and see the rows of simple white slabs running over the little hills as rhythmically as vines. These are the dead, the known and always one unknown, from all the wars since the Civil War. You look down to the river and Memorial Bridge, and beyond that are the weaving line of trees on the river bank, and on the Washington side the very white saucer dome and the supporting columns of the Jefferson Memorial, and just above it the pinkish-white marble of the Lincoln Memorial, and to its right, towering over everything, the huge 550-foot masonry shaft of the Washington Monument, in the center of its park and mall. On the rim of the horizon was the dome of the Capitol. It was a brilliant winter day, cloudless and fogless. But as the sun burned out over the snowfields, the temperature was down to a piercing 12 degrees, 20 degrees of frost. Crossing the Memorial Bridge going away from Washington and toward the cemetery, what you see straight ahead of you is the hill and main slope down to the river and the single commanding Custis Lee Mansion. But on Saturday, on a little plateau below it, you could see a white square, and in the middle of it a curious point of orange light. I suppose that from now on, as long as anyone can foresee, all the motorists who cross the bridge, either to go south or to go to work in the Pentagon, or to take an aeroplane at either of the Washington airports, will see this white rectangle and the light inside it. For this is the gravesite of John F. Kennedy. That, of course, was where I was bound. I am not myself much disposed to lingering over these mournful rituals, and I must say I have always approved of the dispatch with which Americans bury their dead, usually within 2 days of the death. But one of the curious things about this event was its magnetic attraction for the young people. My son, in his early 20s and just graduated from college, is still living in the college town of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and on the Monday of the funeral he came into New York looking like a ghost. He came to tell me about his trip to Washington. He had flown down there from Cambridge the evening before, and arrived outside the Capitol at about 7:30 in the evening. He lined up with the longest and quietest queue anyone could remember, about 250,000 people who waited to go into the Capitol and see their president lying in state under the great rotunda. My son, as I say, got there at 7:30 in the evening. He stood in biting cold and got in at 6 in the morning, into the warmth of the rotunda and the overpowering scent of flowers. He walked around the bier and came out and went to the airport and flew to New York and slept through the afternoon. Like many of his generation, he is not overly sentimental. He said, though, that he felt he just had to do it, and that what he would never forget was the way the crowds stood and talked, and there was only the smallest grumbling if someone jumped his place. I'd guess, he said, that half, maybe 3/4 of the people in line were students or kids of college age. Well, I don't know whether I inferred from this a rebuke that certainly was not intended, but finding myself in Washington last weekend, and knowing that Sunday was the last day of mourning, and seeing the hundreds of flags drooping at half-mast, for Washington, a city built as a political capital and nothing else, has more government buildings in one place than you will see anywhere, I thought I had better go and see the place where he was put to rest. As I walked down from the Lee Mansion, down a hillside planted with wide stone steps, the white rectangle revealed itself as a white picket fence, and already it was possible to feel that some small corner of New England had been planted there. 100, maybe 200 people were lined up in single file along a narrow path that was covered with matting against the frost and snow. While I was there, and afterwards, and as long as the last of the sun allowed you to look back and see them, there were always the same number, moving and halting in a snake line. They stood there, again, very many young people, freezing in blue jeans or shivering in corduroys, and burying their heads in short jackets. The main problem for everyone was holding on to his ears, for after 5 or 10 minutes the sensation was of having lost both your ears and your feet. We stamped and crouched against the knifing wind, and went up the hill and came nearer to the white rectangle and its guard of soldiers. Now you could see on the left a flat standing stone inscribed with the name of the lost baby of the midsummer. On the right was a small cross bearing the inscription, Baby Girl Kennedy. this one never came alive. In the middle was the mound with no stone or slab, but at its head only a circle of flowers, with the seal of the United States described in purple flowers, and around the circle the words, President of the United States. There was nothing but the mound of evergreen fronds and pine leaves, and a few wreaths leaning up against it, and in the centre a guttering flame, and around that the caps of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Considering that Washington is a monumental city, with avenues as wide as Paris, laid out as it was by a Frenchman at the end of the 18th century, you would naturally expect something austere and very grand. With all respect, indeed with a curious kind of respect you never would have anticipated, this looked like the hasty grave of, say, the town clerk or selectman of a small New England village who had died in the night. The picket fence is irregular, because the ground below it buckles and tilts. There had been no time to straighten it out, or, I imagine, to hew and carve a tombstone. So there it was, the earthly remains of the 35th President, beneath a tumble of leaves and fronds and pine cones, and a few caps thrown on top, and no name. It had a sort of rural pathos about it, as if all our pretensions to riches and a career and power had been swept aside in the impromptu energy of some poor village gardener wanting to do his best, by way of tribute, before the nightfall. The snake line of people paused on the hillside of the rectangle, and some people froze askance and snapped pictures, and some just sauntered by. And a soldier or a marine would pull himself straight and salute, and people lifted their necks out of their collars and looked a while, or lifted up their small children and put them down and mooched on. Then we drove back to Washington, dizzy with the cold, and got warm again, and got ready for the evening. All kinds of random and, no doubt, some bold and guilty thoughts came to me after this curious visit, but the one thing that stayed and stays with me was the accidental humbleness of the grave. For though there was time to arrange a great funeral, and the great of many nations emphasized the loftiness and the solemnity and the splendor of the avenues all the way from the Capitol to the cathedral, and then down and across the Memorial Bridge, and all the way to Arlington, when you got there you saw this pile of leaves and a straggly, uneven fence around it. And John Kennedy might just as well have been the promising son of an Irish forebear who, like many another immigrant in Boston, was plucked untimely by some swift epidemic and buried in a bit of ground. Then the Sunday came in, and then the Monday morning with a whirling snowstorm, and the flags, which, after all, are as neutral as clocks, flew high and angrily from the top of their staves. This snowstorm, which blew in from, of all places, the Gulf of Mexico, chilled the usually warm Southland, and tore across the Ozarks and the plains, and blotted out the eastern seaboard and upstate New York and New England, and blew itself out to sea. So I think Tuesday was the dawn that we had been waiting for. A typical shining winter day, cold but brilliant. And now all the wreaths and photographs had gone from the shop windows, and at the United Nations the 113 flags flew high, and the newspapers burst out of their sobriety and started to berate the Congress for hedging the foreign aid bill and keeping the President in Washington. And the Republican papers began to look to November 1964, and the chance of a president to their positive liking. This is not to say that anybody, in print or in private, that I have heard, is beginning to find fault with President Johnson. But once you emerge from this wholly strange stupor, it is already as plain as can be that all the natural emotions of an energetic people were cowed but have not been tamed. The New York Herald-Tribune pipes a trumpet call for Governor William Scranton of Pennsylvania as the next president. Among all the red names that have crept through our subdued conversation of the last month, Governor Scranton's is the one that seems to attract people for, I think, a strong, if pathetic, reason. He is just President Kennedy's age. He is modest and able and attractive, and belongs to that generation that took the torch and had it dashed from its hand. But he is saying nothing. This is still the time to pray and hope for the best from the new man, from the last of the Roosevelt generation who had the torch forced on him. In Grand Central Station, a Massachusetts housewife retorts, "I'm a Republican, but I think President Johnson has been wonderful." A Negro redcap porter says, "If he follows Kennedy, he'll be a good man." A conductor says, "Well, it's too early to tell. I'll wait and see." An attendant at the luggage room says, "I don't know. I still have to work. It doesn't make any difference to me who's president. They all make a lot of promises." "Take it easy, boy," says an onlooker. And what does President Johnson say? He says, "I'm going home to Texas, and maybe I'll get in a day's hunting. Maybe I'll just go off into the hills and do a little communing with myself." We have come through. The Los Angeles Riots, Guardian, 26 August, 1965. By the grace of God, but I'm afraid by hardly any other agency, that gutted suburb of Los Angeles is shaking itself out of the stupor of fear and hate that overtook it once the fires were out and the 10,000 troops of the National Guard moved in. It is an awful lot of troops for a suburb no bigger than the, 70, 80, 110 suburbs of that vast, brash, crackling, and most modern city. I heard, and can well believe, that there was a hair-raising moment on the Sunday or Monday night when it occurred to somebody in the governor's office or the state attorney general's office that if Watts had sparked another riot of this dimension elsewhere, or two others of half the size, California would have had no more troops left. The mere rumor that this was so could have triggered pandemonium in every Negro section that had its share, and which does not, of tough guys on the loose. There is no question that such people started it, but the commission that the President has appointed has to try to find out why they were able to rouse, within a few hours, teenagers and middle-aged and old people into a 3-day frenzy of beating and looting and burning. The scale of the violence at Watts bears no relation whatsoever to the social condition of the suburb. It is a place that most slum dwellers in any old city on the earth would gladly settle for. The houses are small bungalows, mostly on their own little lots, with lawns and backyards, at least one bathroom, 2 or 3 bedrooms, garages, though nobody who built these houses in the 1930s figured on the doubling and tripling of the automobile population, or the human population either, so that the streets bulge with motor cars, a good many, you can be sure, stolen and replated. Southern California has done better than most states in revamping bad neighborhoods and pouring money into Negro welfare. It has never had a poll tax. It never had predominantly Negro sections until the Second World War, though it has long had Mexican sections in the South and Chinese sections in the northern towns. Its schools were integrated long ago, though it did, last year, pass a law that legalizes segregated housing. But you could go on and on listing reasons why nothing of this sort should have happened in or around Los Angeles. And I think none of us should make a finger-wagging point of the fact, asserted and denied, that the federal government had warned California to expect trouble from the Negroes in the Los Angeles suburbs. Just about the safest bet you could make today, except in the rural Midwest and in Vermont, which has practically no Negroes, is that you can expect violence almost any day, any month, in any northern city you care to put your finger on. Northern was not a slip of the tongue. We are just beginning to realize that the chances of open violence are greater where the Negro has more legal and social equality, but still does not have the money or the jobs or the housing he would like. A sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania puts his finger on the irony that hurts. Dr. Seymour Levantman says, "The history of revolution shows that when conditions get better, people become more openly dissatisfied. The disparity between their lot and that of others becomes more evident. It is not accidental that rioting is occurring after the civil rights legislation, not before." This, naturally enough, is the puzzling part to most people, and the wounding part to President Johnson and the civil rights leaders and the young crusading students who go south to join the marchers, and to the former Attorney General Robert Kennedy and his successor Nicholas Katzenbach, who did so much to start the historic landslide of civil rights legislation that thundered through the Congress this year. Of course, every Negro is not going to get the vote this year or next, or share a white schoolteacher, good or bad, or have brand-new housing, or be given a white-collar job. Vast numbers of whites, by the way, are not going to get these things either. The simplest but most excruciating mistake that runs like wildfire through much testy criticism of the United States is to believe that the Negro is, if not in chains, everywhere subjected to a special and shameful code of legal humiliations not shared by white people at the same level of society. In the South, until lately, this has been true. Now in the South, the energy and determination of the federal government, sending registrars and marshals and FBI agents and many brave anonymous clerks into the last ditches of segregation, is something to see. So, while the Negroes of the South are acquiring the common but vital privileges of citizenship, the ballot, the right to sit on juries, the right to a friend at court, the North, which has had most of these things for generations, explodes in an ecstasy of protest. Against what? Against law, property, civil order, and its guardians. It happened, and it was much the same story last week in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Springfield, Massachusetts. But the Los Angeles rioters, unlike the mobs in the 7 rioting cities of last summer, took their protest a stage beyond the first great orgy of looting, which to people rattling around in the same smelly rooms with the same jobless friends must seem like an intoxicating whiff of freedom. The Los Angeles riot, by the 3rd night, gave us sure warning of the next stage in the disintegration or protest of the cities. It turned into a race riot, a hard thing to define, and something the Department of Justice very usefully pointed out last year did not describe the riots in those 7 cities. It should be said that these things always seem to start the same way. A white policeman arrests a Negro, and having looked into several thousand pages of the records, I dare to fly in the face of advanced opinion and say, usually arrested for just cause. The Los Angeles rioters, having taken their fill of liquor and television sets and groceries and furniture and cameras and cash registers and automobiles, turned then to the people of whom these luxuries are the symbols. The owner. Not literally the owners, though I believe there was plenty of resentment and plenty of damage against absentee landlords. I mean the property owner's surrogate, the white man. They roamed after white men and beat up light-skinned Negroes by mistake, and the fact that they also maimed and beat white people who were as poor or shiftless as themselves is not an accident, but an inevitable incident of what had become a symbolic act of rage against the white man. Let us be fairly clear about the kind of people we are talking about. We, as distinct from Pravda and the African radio, and I regret to say quite a few otherwise intelligent liberals, are not talking about decent Negroes hungry for a decent house and a place in society. We are not talking about people who want a vote or a seat on a jury, but people who want a television set, a case of bourbon, a girl, a snazzy car, and a wad of folding money. There are living in Watts the rather appalling number of over 500 criminals out on parole, and it would be a relief to tie up this discussion with the clincher that they started and led the riots. I am sure that they were in there, and they must at all times form a ghastly elite corps for the young unemployed, twice the white rate, the bastards, 1 in 4, the artful dodgers by the 1,000, who thus have 500 Fagins to instruct them in everything from petty thievery to drug addiction to the manufacture of Molotov cocktails. But we have to remember that something very like the Watts explosion happened in Rochester, New York last year, and in Springfield, Massachusetts last week, to the bewilderment of its sober citizens. I believe that the seed of these upheavals, the seed, if you like, of anarchy, is in the poor Negro's envy, not of the white man's vote or his education, but of the white man's fancied wealth and the baubles it buys. Whatever Watts lacks, it does not lack television aerials. I suppose if you sit in a mean room all through the day with a litter of listless children and a worn-down mother, the chances of there being a father in residence are only 3 in 4. And you keep seeing the svelte girls in the automobile ads, and the young white Apollos, and the glowing families, and the house in the pines, secured by a mortgage from the silvery-haired saint in the friendly bank. I suppose you come to believe that this is the way the whites live. They have everything. Not only the vote and the clean jobs and the mathematics, if you are interested, but all the goodies and the money and the golden girls. It is a kind of idiot version of the persistent European belief that all Americans are rich. I saw a poor young student a few months ago trying to cross Germany on about $10, and pretty empty-bellied most of the time. In one place, a woman suggested he take a ferry up the Rhine. He mentioned he could not afford it. She almost fell down in a faint. She went off instead in a huff. "Imagine," she said, "an American without money." Last year I saw some of the looting in Harlem, and the signs were unmistakable in Watts and Chicago and Springfield. The envy satisfied in the moment of seizing sometimes useless luxuries, but luxuries that are the shortcut to the good life, which is not coming soon, a truth that all the trumpets about civil rights only mock. I said earlier we could list forever reasons why this should not have happened in Watts. The sociologists and psychologists and police and politicians have rushed in with all the reasons why it should happen. The Negro birth rate is half again as high as the white. Illegitimacy 4 times. Unemployment twice as bad. School dropouts 3 times. Therefore, 2 or 3 times as many people to a room. Therefore, crime rate 4 or 5 times that of the most comparable white neighborhood. A steadily growing population of young, idle, and corrupt Negroes, already beyond the reach of appeals to citizenship, and beyond much interest in liberty or education, but only in the more dazzling fruits of education. I do not know if it will help much to have isolated this tragic strain of envy, a twisted form of ambition, or to have mentioned the pimping role of television, with its tantalizing exposure of the white man's dainties for sale, perhaps for looting, at your nearest grocer or department store. But these things do not get mentioned by the city fathers, who either moan about morals or say the rioters of Watts must be given a new high school or more federal funds. What they need at the moment is a full-time birth control program, the safe return of some of those parolees to jail, a couple of churches, a public works project, 6 playing fields, and an army of colored men in the police force.